Hello, yes, hello. Good afternoon. Welcome to Modern Fiction. This panel is called either Finding or Losing the Plot. We will do one or the other. I'm Merve Emre. I'm a professor of literature at the University of Oxford and a critic at The New Yorker. And I am very, very pleased today to be joined by three extraordinary writers. Sebastian Barry, the laureate for Irish fiction from 2018.
Former.
Sorry.
Retired.
Former. He'll still give talks on command from 2018 to 2021. I highly recommend, among his many wonderful novels, the book of his laureate lectures, which I hope we will talk a little bit about today. They're quite stunning. He has won or been shortlisted for basically every award you could imagine, including the Booker, the Costa Book Award, the James Tate Black Memorial Prize, and the Irish Book Awards Novel of the Year. And his most recent novel is 1,000 Moons. To his, my left. To his left, we have Ben Okri, a man of extraordinary and varied talents. He is an incredible poet, a novelist, a playwright, a writer of children's books or fables, and his most recent book, The Last Gifts of the Master Artists, is actually a rewriting of one of his previous novels, and he was awarded the Booker Prize for The Famished Road. And to his left, yes, it keeps being the left, doesn't it? And to his left, Susie Boyt, whose wonderful novel, Loved and Missed, I stayed up until 3 a.m. Reading 2 nights ago. I couldn't put it down, and you won't be able to either. She is the author of 7 novels and the beloved memoir, My Judy Garland Life, and has most recently edited and introduced a collection of Henry James's ghost stories and written a play about T.S. Eliot. So could we just have a round of applause for all three of them before we get started? So I will begin with a personal question and then ask all the tricky craft gotcha questions after that. I was recently reading an essay that Ben wrote in The Guardian in which he says that there are 3 reasons why people become writers. 1, a long childhood illness. 2, a near-death experience. And 3, a dramatic fall in the fortunes of your family. So, which one was it for the 3 of you? Or was it some 4th secret thing that you perhaps have never told anyone before? Sebastian, can I begin with you?
Yeah, well, the only option on the mysterious thing called the stage is to have it as one arena of truth where you're just not going to conceal anything. The fact is, my loved father died in January. He was 91, and since he was in some ways a magnificent person, in other ways quite a destructive person for us. And I know that part of the reason I was writing, well, I didn't know it then, but I sort of see it now, that was to somehow, having had the experience of an explosion, to go out into wherever the pieces were and bring them back in and try, of course, ineffectually to put the pieces back together. There's a sense of that. But having said that, we have it's a universal saying, never speak ill of the dead, and I don't wish to do that. But that is the honest answer.
Can I ask a follow-up question to you before we move on?
Yes.
Your laureate.
You didn't leave me anything, by the way. If that's what you were going to ask.
In case you're wondering.
Your laureate lectures begin with a very beautiful sentence that I just would like to read, if I can read my own handwriting. And it's, "All things pass away. Our time on earth is brief. And yet we may feel assailed at great length in the brief time, and yet we may reach moments of great happiness. Does the novel allow us to capture those moments of assailment, of happiness?
The novel is the ragged net that the fishermen have neglected to re-sow, having taken a great catch, where you try to subsequently find the fish of happiness in those nets. And that's the great joy of writing. Although I will also say that as you move through the ferocious parts of a novel, the disgraceful fact for me is also that that is also thrilling, that there's nothing that dismays the writer in the act of writing, which is very disreputable, I think, and should be noted, and maybe even prosecuted in some way. Everything about working, and I feel Susie and Ben will agree with me, when it's working, when the music is essentially moving through your brain, there is no greater privilege than those greater sense of happiness, both childish and right up all your ages to the age you are. So the happiness is there. I mean, the happinesses in my life are legion, actually. And it's part of the depressive personality not to notice that enough. So in some ways I write in order to shock myself into noticing.
That's very good. Ben?
What was the question? It might have changed.
No, well, you could change it if you want to, but the original question was the 3 reasons that you listed why people become a writer, and I said, or is there some 4th hidden motivation of which you have never spoken and would not have spoken in that article, in that essay?
Yeah, I think all the 3 reasons I said still remain. First of all, I want to say what a privilege and pleasure it is to be here in this grand house with tremendous company, conversation, and the privilege of being able to stay here without paying for the duration of the conversation that we're able to sustain. Absolutely beautiful, yeah, very grateful to have met Sebastian and Susan. I've known for such a long time.
And have eaten her cakes, you tell me.
Her cakes,
her brilliant cakes.
She makes excellent cakes,
I mean.
and gives the best parties. But the 3 reasons I gave remain unchanged, except for the last one. When I said the dramatic fall, when I heard you say it there, I wanted to qualify that. I think what I wanted to say was a dramatic change. It has to be a change of some sort, because if your life is, I mean, there are many great artists who've had near great artists. I was thinking of Mendelssohn, who've had very steady, unbroken lives till they're grown up. No dramatic changes in childhood, no illness, no divorces. They're quite happy. It's quite rare. I think Nabokov said somewhere, how happiness is rare amongst artists, in a sense of actually having this steady happiness. If you look into the lives of most artists, most writers, there's been something didn't quite go right somewhere. Some twist of fate, some fall, some malignant touch of destiny with a sense of humor. Something's always not quite right. And I've now come to look upon that as one of the great secret blessings, actually. That not quite rightness of your life compels you constantly to tell stories, not stories that put it right, but that examines the causes, the many causes of happiness and unhappiness, and the many causes of the shape that our lives take. So if there was a 4th one, I would say, I wish I'd said that then, I would say it's a secret quest for, I don't know, maybe some unheard harmony. As I get older, I write from all of my traumas, I write from all of my neurosis and all of that, but I also write increasingly from a tremendous sense of tranquility, which I have acquired as I've gotten older. And the tranquility is not a final tranquility. It's just you want to see the ups and downs of life, and you get increasingly comfortable with the fact that, okay, that's the way it is. I sort of know how to row this boat. not that the boat's not going to be hit by waves, but that I know how to row it. I know how to manage this boat. So.
May I ask a follow-up question
please.
to that? So the last gift of the master artists is a rewriting of a previous novel you had written, and you say that the reason you wanted to rewrite it was because you felt like it did not, in its original form, sufficiently emphasize the politics and the history of slavery. How do you think about the relationship between the personal traumas that make people want to write and the political traumas that it sounds like you at least felt responsible for writing about or bringing to the fore in some way?
T.S. Eliot famously said that the artist should be impersonal in their work. And this tremendous philosophy affected, influenced a large part of the practice of literature for the best part of 50, 60 years. It turns out that he was lying. At least he was concealing something, because of the 20,000 letters that have since been discovered that he wrote to Emily Hale. It turns out that all of his poems were actually secreted with bits and pieces, fragments, revelations from his life. So it turns out that his art was actually quite personal. Mm-hmm. But this impersonal thing that he passed on has also been very influential, and he got it also partly from Joyce, who spoke about the artist like God paring his fingernails in the presence of creation, that sense of distance from your work. We need the trauma. We need a traumaless life. A life without unhappiness cannot really be a fully, greatly creative life. The greater the troubles, the secret troubles, whatever they are, if you have the capacity for the alchemy of art, the greater the art. Whether it's Dante or Cervantes, Cervantes with his one arm and his time in prison where he had to write Don Quixote. Dante driven from Florence by politics and factions. We need it, but we also need this tremendous objectivity. Now, the rewriting of Starbuck, which was published in 2007, it was a full, rich Laurentian novel in a form, in a very African form of cyclicity. But it was too rich. And the main thing that was driving it, this narrative of the slave trade, this politics, this history, got lost in all of that richness. And I felt the need to come back and rewrite the book and reshape it. But actually what I was really trying to do, if I'm really honest with you, was to discover what was present in Starbuck. What was in that book that spoke to now? Because in everything we do, there is a direct line between the book we're writing, even if it's set 200 years ago, if it's set in the future, that book, wherever it's set, and this time now in which we live, suffer, dream, fight, and try to make sense of stuff. And that's what I did with this book, to find its form and to find its direct relationship with now, which is this brooding sense of disaster that's hanging over us that we don't want to face.
It was very eloquently said, and we'll come back to the relationship, I think, between the past and the present. And secreted is the right word for those letters. They're quite sticky in their way, aren't they? Susie, I'll remind you of the question. Of the three reasons why one is compelled to become a novelist, pick one of your three, or tell us about a fourth that Ben's list doesn't account for.
Well, I think for me it came more out of my personality. I was a very, very, very sensitive kid, the kind of girl that if someone left a little bit of mustard on the edge of the plate, it would make me cry. My heart would go out to it on account of its neglect. And I wasn't as bad as the woman I saw on TV once who cried every time she put the rubbish out because she was never going to see it again. But I was not a million miles away. And people were always saying to me, you have got to toughen up, you have got to grow an extra layer of skin or you're going to have a miserable life, which is quite a sort of severe thing to be told when you're about 5. And also I was the youngest of a large family full of very, very strong characters, and it seemed to me from a very early age that all the personality types had already been taken, so the idea of being heard seemed impossible. And I think it was a combination of feeling that I had this layer of sensitivity where everything struck me to the core, even, you know, walking past a window cleaner or just the mildest possible thing went in very, very deep. And also a sense of holding my own in this family of very big characters.
We've been talking a little bit about that relationship between personality and impersonality. And Ben, maybe to add to your Eliot line, he also famously said that only people who know what it is to have a personality want to be impersonal. And your novel, Loved and Missed, is so extraordinarily rich in unspoken feeling. It's very controlled on the surface, and
it's
you
a
can
great
feel
book,
it's a great novel, and you can feel the depths.
I was
up
half the night in Wicklow reading it as well.
You were too, yeah.
I couldn't get over it.
Yeah.
I'm still not over it.
Why don't you guys start books at normal times?
Because they're sensitive people.
You know, how do you think about that relationship between personality and impersonality being translated or shifted onto your prose, which does seem to trade in these amazing contradictions between control and depth of feeling?
Well, I suppose I'm naturally more, this is a fault, but I'm more interested in the inner world than the outer world, so I suppose that's a big part of it. But also, I mean, I suppose I finished that book when the subject we must not mention, which is COVID, was happening. And I suppose the narrowness and the control of the book was a sort of metaphor for how we were living this world in which, you know, it was literally illegal to see your friends, where a lot of the things that lift us were taken away, and there was this sort of emphasis on the bare bones of life. And I'm interested in how people live through and deal with kind of chronic conditions, chronic emotional conditions, or conditions of estrangement. And I noticed as well during COVID that a lot of people's long put away strange behaviours, disorders, addictions, phobias all came back. People who 27 years ago had a problem with anorexia, suddenly it revisited them. And so there was something about that time which was sort of alarming and extra sharp and raw, and some of that came into the book, I think.
Yes, the return of the repressed. It was a time for the return of the repressed. You've written, I can't remember where you've written it, but that one of the books that you reread in order to get the rhythm of that internal life is Margaret Weiss Brown's Goodnight Moon. And what you were saying about COVID just made me think about the scene of that book, which is a mother and a child locked in a room together. And I was wondering, you know, Sebastian, your laureate lectures are also touched by COVID. Maybe we could just speak a little bit to the way that the pandemic and how it disrupted or rearranged our patterns of being together influenced the making of fiction now.
Yeah, but yes, I mean the first two, there were 3 lectures, one a year, and the first one I delivered in the Gate Theatre, and the second one in the Gate Theatre, and the second one was about Donald McCann, our greatest actor, who had been in The Steward of Christendom, a play of mine, and had transformed the lives of myself and Ali and the kids by making us that magical thing called money, you may have heard. And I delivered that on the Abbey stage. You know, Patrick Kavanagh said they don't like writers talking about money because they don't want to give them any. But anyway, I was on the stage in the Gate, not a few feet from where Donald, who had died shortly after the production, which was 27 years ago, had delivered this play. And there was an intense magic in it. And I knew when the audience stood up at the end that they were also standing for the ghost. I couldn't call him a friend. He was more like a mysterious confrère, a mysterious co-conspirator, and yet always with much greater power than me and much more wizard-like and much more majestic. The third lecture, though, was in the pandemic. Well, a couple of things had happened that I was supposed to be dismayed by, which I wasn't really, because they seemed like strange, you know, just fabulous events. One was I published a book in the same week as the first lockdown, which was interesting. And we opened on the West End with a play, and 4 days later that closed. So there was a sense of, Well, there was a financial sense to that as well, if I'm being honest. But the third lecture, therefore, which was about family, it was called The Fog of Family, probably appropriately wasn't delivered on the stage of the Gate Theatre to the assembled people, because it's a tricky thing to talk about. And it took me a couple of years to actually write that lecture. But rather magically, instead of that, my son Toby, who's 25 and a beautiful, radiant person and a great musician and also a good sound man, recorded me in our library delivering the lecture. So the third lecture, which was called The Fog of Family, was delivered in front of one of my radiant children, and that's it. And there was something appropriate about that. So I'm going for the, but that is rather true. I mean, what you say, Susie, about traumas returning, you actually were explaining something to me as you spoke, because I was very troubled and bothered by certain conditions that were, and I'm glad I wasn't the only one now. I should talk to people more, shouldn't I, to find out that actually there's a commonality of experience, apparently. But yeah. So does that even begin to answer what you asked me? No, not at all.
But we're not about answering, are we?
No. We're about getting it wrong.
You can pass it to Ben if you would like.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, yes, please, take it away, Ben. You know, when Obama came to visit Ireland, in order to reconnect himself, and he of course, he has Irish ancestry, he said the thing about his name was that it had lost the apostrophe. And so now we've decided, Ben and I, that he is actually Okri. And Okri rather marvelously means heart in Irish, so he's Ben from the heart, and I believe that's exactly a description of you.
It's interesting you say that, because my mother and my dad, who got divorced when I was really young, one of my traumas. Years afterwards, when my mom would refer to my dad, she would say about him, "Oh, but your dad, God, he has heart."
How lovely.
So, well done.
Just for a moment, we observe a silence for that.
But
it's fantastic.
But the pandemic, I mean, it's wonderful what you said about that you wrote your novel during that hermetic period. I found it fascinating and unprecedented, and I think it'll take a while. I'm amazed that you've already begun to synthesize many of the feelings. I just thought it was unprecedented what it did to us. And I think one of the things that I felt that it did, because I have a great interest in alchemy, and there's one of the conditions of alchemy, one of the very difficult conditions. There's 7 stages, seven conditions, and one of them that is really, really fascinating is they call it separation, and it's actually, in psychological terms, it's when the self or a community or a set of conditions is sealed off, so that the changes that needs to go on within it can take place without any external chemical interactions. And it's strange that was a tragic period as well as a hermetic period, that so many people died and there was a lot of loneliness, a lot of separation of families, but there was also that tremendous hermetic space, which I find, with a little bit of guilt, I found to be tremendously creative. I wrote in new ways. I was able to explore difficult things in a way that would have taken me walking around the block thousands of times to be able to get to in normal times. I wrote this play, which, like yours, it didn't close because it came towards the end of the pandemic, but people were too frightened to come out. Mm-hmm. So the play opened. It was set in ancient Egypt, appropriately, home of alchemy. And it closed, but having actors, it had 2 actors, having to rehearse in hermetic spaces. They went in and they took swabs, and that was extraordinary for the theatre. And the stage was arranged in such a way that people were sitting practically 3 feet from one another. So the stage, for the first time, had this very spooky emptiness, with people spaced or quite far away from one another, and it took away that tremendous communal feeling that theatre gives. But then it introduced another feeling of the hermetic communal feeling in which you very rarely get in theatre, unless, of course, it's a very unsuccessful play. Apart from that, I found poetry to be the place. I found it easier to go into. I think lockdown and poetry work really well together. Again, because of depth of exploration and sensitivity that you talked about.
I think what both of you said, Sebastian, you about your son, one person filming you for an audience of who knows how many, and then what you just said about hermetic community is a really beautiful formulation for thinking about how we can be both private and public, personal and impersonal, all at once.
But that hermetic was also hermetic with family, because I never had a more intense interaction with my most immediate family, my partner and my daughter. We got really close. We spent time singing songs, choreographing dances in a way that we would never have done before.
And in having my son, I felt I had enough people in the room.
Yeah.
You represented humanity.
I went into lockdown with a bad attitude, and that I have the reputation for being brilliant in a crisis, so I thought, I'm going to give this family a lockdown to remember. And sort of made incredible meals every night for about 3 weeks, and literally got housemaid's knee from how much cleaning I did, stacks of ironing every evening. And then I realized it was completely unsustainable. I was tearing my hair out, and then thought that we could get away with a good enough lockdown rather than the best lockdown in the land.
The Winnicott lockdown. Well, the guilt that Ben was talking about, Susie, did you feel any of that, or do you feel any of that, or has that been completely kind of sublimated into the novel?
No, I mean, I noticed that in lockdown, if you were lucky enough to have enough space and some outside space, you were incredibly lucky. But I also noticed that nobody felt all right, and if you talked to friends and you did, after a while, confide that you were a bit miserable, they would sort of hold your misery up to the light and work out whether it was acceptable or realistic or not, which didn't feel very nice. And I hated, I did some work things on Zoom, but I hated seeing friends on Zoom. It just felt like really bad telly, or that you couldn't. I just hated it. It felt like everything was being performed and acted and false and fake. But I did start talking to people on the phone all the time, which is something I've always done. And my record for a phone call is 17 hours. So and I haven't had much of that lately. But I realised I needed to talk to 3 friends for sort of half an hour at least every day, and that really lifted me, because I did start going a bit crazy, particularly with the ironing.
I never talked to my neighbors quite so much as during lockdown, because of the long walks. In normal times, you ignore one another. I mean, I've been in the same house with people for 10 years. We've never spoken to one another.
I never talked to my wife so much.
You know, the question of...
Can I say something?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, it was like, wasn't it like going down the snake in Ludo, down to start again? Because speaking of my wife, it did shock me the degree to which all our early days came back to me, and the degree to which, in some mysterious dispensation of the pandemic, you fell in love with the person again. That was very shocking to me. I mean, it was revivifying.
Although I know a case of a couple who'd been together for 35 years, and lockdown was the excuse they needed to just go their different ways.
Yes, well, what you just said would be shocking to me and my husband too, so. The question of how to make fiction now in 2022 brings up the question of how people were making fiction before, and we are celebrating a centenary. 1922 was an extraordinary year for many of the authors that the 3 of you have mentioned. Eliot, Joyce, no one's mentioned Woolf, but I'm a Woolfian, so I will. How do you think about the difference between making fiction now and making fiction then? in whatever past you want to look back to, whether it is 1922, whether it's before that, whether it's the novel that was rewritten for 2022. What do you think is there a difference for you in how you make fiction now versus how either you or other people made fiction before?
Do you want to go first?
Anyone can start.
I suppose it feels the stakes are higher in a way, but I'm probably still writing about the things I've always written about, chiefly how we bear the things we can't bear, all the different ways family life can go wrong, and what, if anything, can be done about it, how to be good in the world without taking on the taint of the word worldly. Those are the things that I've always been looking at. And
can you say more? How to be good in the world without taking on the taint of the worldly? Can you say more about that?
Well, I suppose it seems to me to sort of duck away from things or narrow yourself in order to avoid things isn't good enough. It's not all right to look away from difficult things, to fence yourself off. So a sense of living fully in the world, but without being tainted by it somehow. And when I was at university, there was a lot of talk about literary works that presented a completely realized world of their own that didn't seem to in any way depend on the so-called real one. That's what we thought. You know, if you think of the atmosphere of Keats's Eve of St. Agnes or something like that, a world that's really of its own making. And I thought that was the thing to go for. And then I realized you can't discount the actual world. That was such a sort of odd thing to be trying for, and so little by little it's come into the world of my books. It doesn't feel like something I have to defend myself from anymore.
Well, they famously say a bad review killed Keats, so I don't know how much he discounted it either, the actual world outside of it. Ben?
Now that you raise the issue, I realize that in 1922, the writers, those great writers writing then, were writing. I never considered it before, the weight of it. They were writing in the aftermath of two great world wars that shattered everything that went before, destroyed the world as you knew it, destroyed storytelling as you knew it, destroyed emotion as you knew it, destroyed communication, the idea of the self, all the psychological perceptions that we had, anthropological, just everything got shattered by those two world wars, not to talk of the deaths involved. And then there was that huge pandemic. There was a flu pandemic that Fitzgerald talked that swept through Europe and killed more people than the wars. I never realized how much they were writing in the shadow of such huge events. And I think it explains why uncertainty and the constant change of form, the mutation. You look at Ulysses, you look at the Wasteland, they both share that. Every chapter is different, is trying for something. You have this night times chapter at the end of Ulysses. You have this whole section in the Wasteland that is kind of meditation on mountains in an abstract way. Whereas we've had lots of wars, but we don't have that same immediate, vast trauma behind us that compels you towards new form. Because I think that's what trauma does. Trauma compels you to new form. It compels you to story, yes, the story of the trauma, but just telling the story of the trauma is very rarely enough. This terrible thing happened to me is never rarely enough. We're also compelled as artists to find the form in which to express that trauma. And that is one of the greatest pursuits, I think, one of the biggest challenges and explorations that's involved in the kind of work that we're all trying to do. But I realize that I've been working in the shadow of a trauma, which is a trauma of the Nigerian Civil War, which was very personal, broke down everything. All the optimism that Africa had, that Nigeria had, coming after independence. The Nigerians thought, hey, we're going to remake the world anew in our own image. We're going to be our own people. We're going to be our own selves. We're going to tell new stories. We're going to give a whole new idea of what it is to be African. We're going to be this. We're going to be that. And then the Civil War came along and just shattered everything, and all the innocence, all the hope, all the possibilities just died in that conflagration. And the generation that came afterwards, my generation, were just left with just fragments and a whole mess to sort of put together. And that's the reason why in a novel like The Famished Road, I was going back, all the way back to the old enchantments. Because I wanted to find the music. I wanted to find the music with which to remake the cracked music of our times. It was intensely personal, and I lost relations. You saw dead bodies floating on the river. So I was looking for a childhood song. I went back to childhood to find the song, those old songs, and to find a form from those songs with which to tell a new story. And that's what I've been exploring ever since, because these traumas, they don't go away just because time has passed.
And of course, song was so important to those two artists that you just named, to Joyce, and song is very important to you. I heard you sang earlier.
Allegedly singing.
Yes.
It's a bit like my running, which is really stumbling, but no, we can draw a veil over it. No, that's a lovely question, actually, because of course, we have, at that time, we've just had the War of Independence in Ireland and the Irish Civil War. And that's what civil wars do. They destroy the more innocent hopes of the nascent country. And indeed, in the Houses of Parliament, in the Dáil, one of the senators, or one of the TDs said, "We have murdered the baby in its cradle," which is a very violent image. But at the same time, Ben refers to the fragmentation of hope and the breaking apart of things. Then it becomes a question of retrieval, as I said earlier, and trying to put them back together. But another way of asking that question is, what has changed, not just about novels, but about writers? And I read Latin and English at Trinity College Dublin. And at the end of that process, and in my case, reading Latin very, very slowly, I was the worst Latin student in the history of the world. But you did feel, like when I went to Assisi, I did feel I could drop in on Propertius. There was a sense of the eternal present of that writerly creature. I mean, I suspect, medically speaking, writers are those creatures who have a part of their brain that is helpfully derelict in most people. They just don't bother with it, but out of which you write. I don't know where it is exactly. I'm pointing meaninglessly at this part of the brain. And it isn't necessarily connected to anything else in the brain. It's not necessarily connected to memory, except in the time of working. You're so concentrated. You're so much the jazz player that it is your glory and the best part of you. And I'm not sure that's ever changed. I don't see how that could ever be different in any time. Of course, the times change against you. And to me, the death of all that, the end of all that was Sartre's being a nothingness, where he had been through some further wars. He'd been through the Shoah, he'd been through this, that, and the other, and there was a sort of quenching of the human spirit, and then the job was to have the 60s, I suppose, and try and open it back up again. Open up the heart, the Cree. But it's a fabulous question. I mean, I know you're a very brilliant person, and I was so scared to say it, but I'm glad you've stimulated me to this degree, and I'm shocked by my ignorance.
Are you still scared? You're okay. You're fine.
I'm sort of reconciled. I'm treating you as my cleverer sister.
Let me pick up on something you said. You mentioned education. Both of you have mentioned, jokingly, money. But of course, one thing that is different in writers is that increasingly, education is less and less well-funded, particularly at the primary and secondary levels, and that it is harder to make a living as a writer. So what would you say to young people who wanted to figure out how to make a living as a writer today?
Okay.
It's harder, but also easier. There are more magazines around of different kinds now than 30, 40, 50 years ago. They're more, if you want to write for screen, for TV, they're more theaters than they were, in spite of the fact that they're closing down and libraries are closing down. It's both. I think what I'd say to the young writer today is write your heart out and find a way to live one way or the other, but just write as if, because it does, your life depends on it. But also write with a sense of humor. I think the danger. I wish I had laughed a bit more when I was learning to write in my teens and early 20s. I kind of took it too seriously. I was rather grim about it. Went around carrying Ezra Pound's The Cantos. And you know,
So did I.
You did too.
Yeah.
Yes, damaging book, isn't it?
Yes.
Because don't
when
do
you
that,
mentioned the
young
First
writers.
World War, he said, "For an old bitch gone in the teeth." That was Europe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it just took a period of homelessness. It took finding a community of friends to just get that humor back. And I think humor, a sense of humor, even if the humor is not in your work, but in the spirit of writing, I think is really, really crucial. I think the money thing kind of takes care of itself, I find, because if you have to write, well, you find a way to write. You find a way to fund your life, and you'll write whatever time you need to write. When I was writing my first novel, I used to wake up at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, and I wrote for an hour before going to work. It used to take 2.5 hours to get to work. That's how bad the traffic was in Lagos. So I'd have to wake up really early, write for an hour, take 2.5 hours getting to work, and then another 2.5 hours getting back. I'll sleep for an hour, write for 2 hours, and you just find a way to do it.
It's interesting what you say about having that seriousness to you as a young writer. I remember as a very small child feeling that I was sort of too serious for human consumption, that deliberately trying to lighten myself to be acceptable in that way. And what you were saying about the sort of status of writers now. I mean, when Eliot married Valerie for his second marriage, they got married at 7 o'clock in the morning to avoid the paparazzi, and you couldn't imagine that now.
Let me ask one final question before I turn to all of you, and you should all be thinking of questions to ask while I ask this question, which is, tell me what you are working on now. Susie, can I start with you?
I agreed to contribute an essay to an anthology of essays about Sigmund Freud, and I agreed to spend a night sleeping at the Freud Museum in London, which was pretty stupid.
There's a good couch there.
Yeah. Exactly. So I spent 4 hours in the study, sort of looking at the couch as if it was a play about to start with no actors, and then they made up a little bed for me in Anna Freud's bedroom upstairs, which is partly a storeroom now, and of course happened to have 6 quite large tripods in it, and guess who has a mild insect phobia? And I looked at them and I thought, this night is not going to go well. And on the other side there was a poster of Sigmund Freud, maybe about 8 times the life size, and underneath it said, "It is said that the 20th century person was born on Freud's couch." So my bed was between these scary sort of Louise Bourgeois style insects and this great picture, and I after about an hour of trying to get to sleep, I managed to become so frightened that I was rooting around, but amazingly found the Freud Museum's biscuit cupboard. and a little bit of vitamin S, which is what we call sugar, really saved the day. But anyway, I'm writing an account of that.
This sounds like it could be one of Freud's case studies. I mean, this is amazing. I want to put you on a couch and talk to you about it even more.
But what Susie didn't mention, of course, is her direct connection to the Freud family. So that's also in itself very, very interesting. I'm working on quite a few things, but the 2 things I want to talk about is the children's book I just published, which is kind of written for the ages of 5 to 105. And it's deliberately written to the, I've always wanted to do this, not to write to the adult, not to write to the sophisticated person, a person of the world, the worldly as you mentioned it, but to write a story that is addressed directly to the sleeping child or the not so sleeping child in everybody. And I wrote this book called Every Leaf a Hallelujah, set in Africa and inspired by that wonderful and little person over there called Mirabella, my daughter. And did I just make you shy, Miriam?
She throws her eyes
She
to
just
heaven.
rolled her eyes at him big time. Yeah.
As well I remember.
And the other thing I'm doing that I'd love to share with you, I was really delighted to hear that you've written a play about T.S. Eliot, because I'm doing a recital for my sins of The Wasteland at the Marylebone Theatre on the 11th of November. If you're about, I am doing the full poem.
What's your favourite bit?
Oh my goodness, I have so many. The hyacinth.
Hyacinth girl.
You gave me flowers first. You gave me hyacinths first a year ago. They call me the hyacinth girl. Yeah. And when we left late the hyacinth garden, your arms full, your hair wet, I could not speak.
Oh, I have chills. Does anyone else have chills?
My eyes failed me.
It's lovely giving people hyacinths for that reason.
Yeah.
I often do.
Yeah. Where do you get your hyacinths from?
St John's Wood High Street.
So that's the passion. That's the thing I want to share right now.
That's fantastic. Are tickets available?
Just about.
Just
so
about. Okay.
Go.
Get your tickets.
Go get tickets.
Get your tickets.
Well, actually, these are the bound proofs of my new book, which I'm still working on, but I didn't bring it to read from it or anything. I just wanted to introduce it as an object to human beings.
Love that title, by the way.
Thank you. So book, these are humans, and hopefully they'll take some interest in you. And humans, this is the book, very tremulous and nervous book. That's so brand new, I don't even know what's in it. And you may tell me some other time what it's about. That would be very helpful, thank you.
It's called Old God's Time.
Why did you call it Old God's Time?
Well,
are you referring to the old gods? Are you?
Well, that's a very good question. Depends where you put the apostrophe. With your name. I was in my carpenter's workshop because he was making some windows for a workroom that I was making for Ali, my wife, in the house. And he used a beautiful old phrase that I hadn't heard for a long time. I'd heard it last probably out of the mouth of my grandfather. He said, well, sure, that was in the old God's time.
Ah.
Meaning for so long ago that there was no record of it, or we rarely talk about it. And when I told Dennis Monaghan, or Lord Monaghan as I like to call him, that I had used his phrase, he was so pleased. And he said, what's it called then? And I said, it's Old God's Time. He said, no, that's completely wrong. Sure, it's Old God's Time. But I didn't have the courage to put the U into it. But that's where it came from.
Fantastic.
He's looking for 10%, but I'm not giving it. He's dear enough as he is.
When is this? When is
That's
it due
March
to be
next
published?
year.
March
Yeah.
Does it slightly suggest that the current god's a bit of an upstart and the
better
of the past? Yeah.
No, and we do have plenty of old gods. We were fully equipped with gods.
Oh yeah.
Till 700 years ago.
Yeah, in some places, too many of them.
Yeah.
Let me turn it over to the audience. Who has a question? There are roving mics. Whenever.
Thank you. Hello, this is a question for Sebastian. I was at your previous talk earlier and I wanted to ask you then, so I could do it now. You said that you didn't learn to read until you were about 9. Well, two things. Your mother didn't teach you to read, so I'd be interested to know who did and how you learned to read, and also, I think that was a blessing in disguise.
I do too. I was certainly listening and noting things. One of my books, Annie Dunn, is written and I'm in it as a little boy, and I thought maybe when I was 9 it must have been, but my mother said, no, you were 4. So beware, your 4-year-old is taking notes, yes. Sorry, what was the question?
About your mother
Who
didn't
taught you
teach
that?
you to read, so who did? And obviously, I think it was a blessing in disguise to you.
I was in London as a little boy at an LC school in New End in Hampstead. And I don't know whether it was being slightly out of my element as a human person and being busy learning to be a young London boy for the survival in the playground. So I was talking like that as a little boy, of 8 or 9. I don't think I had time to learn to read English. But when we went back home, they had this very useful thing in the school. The first thing I had to do was stop talking like a young London boy, because I was going to be killed in the yard. So I learned very quickly how to be an Irish boy again, which I think had a big effect. But they had a thing called the Catechism, the Catholic Catechism. And it was incredibly useful to me because it was, who made the world? God made the world. And these little stabby sounds like God, then suddenly I could actually get a G-O-D on it. So I literally deciphered the mysteries of language through the Catholic Catechism because it was learned by rote.
It was useful to Joyce too.
Really?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
I went to a convent and it was slightly similar, as you can imagine. And the Stations of the Cross are a good way to learn.
Yeah. I mean, all of that, anything that's repeated.
Yeah.
So it was as if you were a little actually boy being given lines, and then you were able to match up the sounds with the thing. But once it was done, once that magic was done, my father had a traveling bookcase made for him by his father, and it was full of Penguin books and Criterion, all those old magazines, and if that's the right one. And it was just, my sister could read from the age of 3 or 4, so she's one of those wonderful people. But once I knew I could enter those books, it was better to wait it so long to get the level of shock then, that they were actually full, not of indecipherable marks, but of entire worlds that you could generate by having it in your lap, in that secret thing we do with books where the world is rising up. So, I still can't read very well.
I saw a hand back there. Oh. Can we just mark the little boy? Yes, you're next. You're next, okay? Thank you.
Inspired by your question about the way in which things have changed in the last 100 years, from 1922 to now, and this is for any or all of you, there are those who've argued, and you all may be horrified by the very thought of this, that the great TV dramas of the last 25 years have the role in society that the great Victorian novels had in the end of the 19th century. And I was wondering whether you felt that what role drama plays in people's lives has impacted on the novel and the way that novelists write and think, or whether it's a supreme irrelevance.
Yeah, I had that provocation delivered to me at a booker meeting, because I'm on the board. Someone said, "Oh, the novel, you novelists, you're out of date. The TV series has taken over your territory." And I drew back for a bit, and I didn't say anything because I didn't want to rise at a place like that. But the fact is that photography changed the art of painting, because for a long time painters looked at photographs and they thought, okay, that's us. That's us done. This thing can reproduce reality as we approximate it much better than what we're doing. But actually, it was just a tremor. And what it actually did was that the painters, the great painters, the best painters, actually realized pretty quickly that photographs are inaccurate about reality. Photographs give the impression of an absolute demarcation between the subject, the person, and the space around them. And the great painters realized pretty quickly that when you look actually very clearly, there isn't really an exact demarcation. That there's a sort of a blending into the space around us. And it gave rise to all the great forms of modern painting. And I think the same thing is true with the series. They tell stories better, they deliver the stories much better, much clearer. They give us epochs and big families with big personalities and big stories. And that's exactly what the Victorian novel does. But what the series don't do is they don't take you into one person's spirit. They don't take you into the way in which we actually live our experience. They don't take you into the sensitivity areas that Susie was talking about, the way in which one thing can constantly seem like another, the way in which our lives are lived by things that appear to be on the margin. They don't take you through the way in which myths and stories and legends and rumors and incidental things actually affect the big flow of our lives. They don't take you into the mysterious territory of sensation, of touch, of the poetic perception of life, of the form that crisis takes, and the way it affects your consciousness, the way in a car crash, when you have an accident and you come out of the car, the way for a moment everything just seems to slow down. In other words, that extraordinary territory of consciousness, which is the key area, the key arena of our lives. So what these series have done is they've just simply called off this external stuff, the plot that this conversation is supposed to be about. They've called that, they've taken that, we've left that to them, and they've left us the greater sea of the real enchantment.
But I think what's interesting about the way you phrase that question, is we don't actually have to see these as two different things. We can see in it a kind of historical continuity between the serialized novel, which was the form of the 19th century novel, and the serialized drama. And we can make arguments about what one does better than the other, but we don't have to disavow the pleasures of either. That's the great thing about consuming art. You can consume lots of different kinds of art and get different kinds of pleasure from it.
And fundamentally, I mean, the screenplay, which is obviously the basis of that sort of drama, is written from a different part of that brain. I couldn't write a screenplay to save my life. And people obviously have always been rather hungrily and enthusiastically predicting the death of the novel, and yet people go on writing them.
Go on reading them.
And I think it's because it is a very ancient form that was waiting maybe for the technique of writing to disseminate more fully. But you could still have floating oral novels in a certain way. I just think it's a thing that we do, even if you're a godless person and don't believe in anything after death, that will stimulate St. Peter to be a bit more merciful to human creatures, that they do this odd, disreputable thing called writing novels. We hope, anyway.
Could we? Yes, there is
I want to hear Susie's response to that.
Yeah, I would just add that I don't read for plot at all. I read for texture and atmosphere and character, and I've never made a distinction between the people in books and the people in real life. So even when I was quite young, I'd think, oh, that person's doing that thing that Jane Eyre used to do, and I don't feel that way about television shows to the same extent. And I suppose what you were saying about the complete landscape of feeling, the complete landscape of consciousness, that's what I'm really interested in the internal world. And the books I like most have people sitting around really thinking about things, and that's impossible to do on the screen with any kind of depth.
Yeah, you take something like War and Peace. My goodness, you see the music of a thought be interrupted by a war, and it will come back afterwards. Or the way in which one of the characters is leaving their home, they pass a tree, they go to the war, they're traumatized, they come back years later and the tree has flowered. It's like only in a novel can you have that strange, dialogue with time.
Or when you say something and you hear it strike the person you said it to as something completely different from what you said, and you see them responding to this thing that hasn't been said, that you would never ever say, and think, how can you rescue that moment? And that kind of thing you can do in a book, but it's very, very hard to do.
Although in homage to Brian Cox, who sat just about where you are, Succession was bloody good. Just in case he gets wind of this talk.
We have time for one last question.
Yay!
Yay!
What are the top 5 tips to be an author, maybe?
The top 5, yes, okay. Excellent. The top 5 tips to be an author. How old are you? How old are you?
7.
7, okay.
Can you read?
Can you read? That's you so much.
With the same person.
Yeah, okay.
Read as much as you can.
Quickly. You each have 15 seconds. Top 5 tips.
Well, I would say read as much as you can, which is obviously what we're...
Yeah.
Is that it?
Well,
Top 5?
Do we have to do 5 each?
No, just each of you. Are all of you saying read as much as you can? That is your number one tip.
Well, I would say pay attention to the world. What Henry James said, be one on whom nothing is lost. Be fascinated, and constantly turn that fascination into words.
note,
it says 0 here.
It says 0. We can't answer that question. I'm so sorry. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Just be interested.
And ask lots of questions.
A round of applause for our excellent panelists.